some of the deficits in this book are becoming more and more clear to me. In particular, I mean, the author mentions this up front, but the fact that he doesn't talk at all about Jain philosophy and the tradition of Jainism and so on. And I've started looking into that, not that deeply, but it's extremely fascinating and extremely complex. One thing that I gathered was that if you think that the tetralemma or the Nyāya version of syllogism, of those,
Hmm.
logical arguments, if you think that that's complicated, then you should check out Jaina syllogism, where they have seven truth values.
Oh, wow.
So, I mean, I want to look more into it because it's quite fascinating the way that the logic works. First of all, the Jainas are basically, in some respects, the mirror image of the Madhyamaka Buddhists. If you take the interpretation of Madhyamaka and Nagarjuna and so on as essentially refuting all positions, which is to say that all
Yeah.
positions are ultimately false. Um, the Jainas are the sort of negative image of that, where they say that all positions have some ultimate truth, but they don't get it all right. And the real problem is absolutism,
Mm.
Oh, okay.
the idea that that there are truths in each of the positions, but the way you get to ultimate truth is to somehow hold in your mind an infinite
Possible.
collection of positions.
Hmm.
Mm.
Right. And one of the things that I think follows from that, I'm not sure that this is correct, so I need to do a little more reading, but um, they believe, so like the way the seven truth values work is that you have true, false, inexpressible. Those are the three kind of like atomic truth values. And then you've got true and false, true and inexpressible, false and inexpressible, and true and false and inexpressible.
Mm.
Wow.
And
Do they give examples of these?
yeah, I need to do more reading to. I don't want to. I don't want to say something that's false here. But one way that I was so first of all, the other thing on top of all of that is that when they express those truth values in say like a syllogism, they're saying, okay, so like does Atman exist or not? And then here are the possibilities. Atman exists. Atman does not exist. It's inexpressible whether Atman exists. It's both true and false that Atman exists, etc., like that, going through the truth values. However, each time they say that, they start the sentence with conditionally, Atman exists. Conditionally, Atman does not exist.
Mm.
The word for that is siat. And so the idea with conditionally is that if you were, so what whenever you express a finite position, it's always going to be false because what is true is the sum total of those true components of individual perspectives.
Mm.
So whenever you
Conditional.
express one perspective, you always have to say conditionally
Yeah.
because it's conditional to that perspective.
Yeah.
So one way that I found to kind of make sense of just on a global level, it's not quite at the level of an example yet, but one way that I've seen described is that you could think of reality, or at least the sphere of logic here, maybe not reality yet, although I think it's also something that is descriptive of reality on the um, Jaina account. But in any case, you could think of all of these positions as essentially being a sum total of propositional forms that taken together are inconsistent, but then they're like subsets that are all internally consistent.
Mm.
And so I guess the trick, I'm not totally sure. Maybe the trick is to find all the consistent, like whatever the unique set of all consistent beliefs or all consistent propositions from that mass total of propositions, and that would be ultimate truth. However, what I've also discovered is this idea that um uh what is it called? mm, I forget the Sanskrit word, but this idea of positional thinking, of perspectival thinking, of
Mhm.
Dosana?
non-dogmatic thinking, this idea that anti-absolutist thinking means that to the extent that, say, the Buddhists or the Nyaya or whoever get it wrong, it's because they're being too much of an absolutist with respect to their position. And the Jaina perspective is against that. And so I don't remember the name in Sanskrit for, or whatever the language is. I think it's Sanskrit for that. But essentially, the idea is that you can get to truth by avoiding absolutism. However, apparently that's not just a epistemological position. They actually think that reality is set up in a way that is uh, actually sort of like open in this
Mm.
respect or infinite in this respect. So, like one way of looking at it, there are the four unanswered questions that were posed to the Buddha. I don't know if you know these.
Yeah.
The thing is that they're all, or at least three of them, are quite similar to the questions that Kant poses as the antinomies, and those questions are things like, does the soul exist, independently from the body, or does it not exist? Did the world have a beginning, or has the world, the universe, gone on infinitely in time, etc.? There are four questions like that. Um, and so here's how Kant responds to that. He says that you can give a logical argument for either the affirmative or the negative in any of those questions.
Mm.
And so that shows that, according to Kant, that our knowledge is finite. There is a truth about whether the world, the universe has gone on infinitely in time or had a beginning, but we can't know it. And the proof that we can't know it is that you can give rational arguments, rational proofs for either the affirmative or the negative.
Mm.
So that's the idea that there is a real truth out there, but our knowledge is imperfect. Our knowledge is somehow faulty. Um, I gather the Jaina position is that you can actually have absolute knowledge.
Mm.
It's just that reality is set up in such a way that um, in such a way that both the affirmative and the negative are real. In other words, I'm not sure if it's clear what I'm saying, but like the normal kind of default position we'd be in is that, there's some question out there we can't answer, but there is a right answer out there. We just can't know it.
Mhm.
I guess the Jaina position is we can know the right answer. It's just that reality itself is indeterminate. We
Mm.
can know the indeterminacy of reality
Oh.
instead of reality is determinate and our knowledge is indeterminate.
Mm-hmm.
Is it clear?
Mm-hmm.
Mm. Okay.
It's an interesting perspective. I mean, if everything's contextual and everything's changing, and in some ways it aligns with some of the Buddhist philosophy that everything is changing. And
Yeah.
and they even just, talk about how things have to be contextual because things are changing. You can't pin anything down. It's also interesting because I started listening to that podcast
Hmm.
that you suggested about
Yeah.
the podcast without any gaps. So I'm on the pre-Socratics, and a number
Oh.
of them pre-Socratics, some of them believed in, they said, if this was true and this was true, how can both be true? But they would argue sometimes that both are true, and then they would get sort of flustered about how to understand it.
Hmm.
So they could argue in kind of like you're saying, Kant can show later.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting, and
Mm.
apparently there are some. Um, I'm not prepared to say anything about the different interpretations of quantum mechanics, but apparently there is a interpretation of quantum mechanics that holds that reality itself is indeterminate, and it's not just our knowledge of reality that's indeterminate,
Mm.
which if that's correct, would support this idea that you can have sort of infinite knowledge. In fact, I gathered that that's what uh, uh, enlightenment means for the Jainas. This idea that you can grasp the infinity of positions, or at least certain people have done that in the past. I think Mahavira, their central figure, probably they would say that Mahavira was able to grasp the infinity of positions or something like that. But I gather there's this idea that the indeterminacy is not something that describes our inability to know reality. Rather, the indeterminacy is in reality itself, and we can know that in a determinate way.
Ah. Mm.
I mean, I hear what you're saying. I can't quite gather how it leads to a different end in a sense. If it's always indeterminate, then isn't it always you can't? It's
Yeah, I'm
inexhaustible.
not
You
totally
gotta know.
sure that my interpretation is correct. That's why I have to do more reading. But I think there is this idea that just because it's infinite, it has this constant openness to it,
Yeah.
right? That's the idea. Um,
Right, but I would understand. What's confusing to me is how would you ever get to the end of something inexhaustible that's always changing?
I suppose the summation of the infinite series of fractions or something, maybe that would be a way to do it. I don't know. But in any case, I only brought that all up, and as I said, I'm not really prepared to talk about Jainism or anything, but just to show that there is this huge gap in this book, which it would sure be nice to have a little bit more
Well, yeah, that
about.
is
So,
fascinating. I like the fact that it's in a way against absolutism because it's in a way it's against dogma. You
yeah,
know the
yeah,
you know
right, exactly. I think that you know, there's the problem with Nagarjuna's approach, or maybe it's not even Nagarjuna's. In the Mula Madhyamaka Karika, since it's all a series of aphoristic verses, it's not quite at the level of making an argument, a continuous chain of inferences or something like that. But in the commentaries, particularly in Chandrakirti's commentary, but also in the other one, Bhaivika, um, there's this attempt to give a rational defense of, say, the theory of emptiness or something like that. And as I said, that you can read the surface level as being propositional, although if you want it to actually be coherent, you have to take a different interpretation that is not about making propositional arguments,
right.
but it's like doing something performatively with language or whatever. But the problem is that both the surface level looks like a bunch of propositions, and also the whole historical context in which these things were written was within the Vada tradition of debate,
Debate, yeah,
and so it's a real problem, I suppose, for a position that ultimately probably isn't really about making rational arguments, that it has to present itself this way. And so if you read it, if you read, say, Nagarjuna in terms of propositional arguments, um, it's not hard to, point up contradictions, in which case it seems like the argument fails. And one of the reasons that that would happen is the fact that they are absolutely committed to the non-reality of everything, right? Or of
Mhm.
all positions anyway, nothing that we can express as ultimate truth and so on. And that in itself is a kind of absolutist position,
hmm
right?
Mm.
The Jainas also have a problem, which is that you know, if every position is ultimately perspectival, right? If every position uh,
it's contextual.
is contextual or whatever, conditional and so on, then what about
Yeah,
the Jaina position itself?
yeah,
So it has the same sort of problem, in any theory, uh, a way to test whether you should accept a theory is whether the theory can survive being applied to itself,
Mhm.
yeah.
right?
And
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 Buddhists wiggle out of that, or Nagarjuna wiggles out of that, right?
well, you have to bring a lot of interpretation to Nagarjuna in order for him to be able to wiggle out. It's not
Yeah.
there literally in the text. You know what I
Oh,
mean?
okay.
You have to bring something extra, which means that in a certain respect, it's a fiction that you're telling about what's there.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what this book is trying to, or at least brings up this point, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I was
but
thinking that.
my only point is that, that's how I was trying to save Buddhism from the problem of or at least Madhyamaka Buddhism in this
Mhm.
particular Vada tradition. One way to enable it to survive being applied to itself is not to say that the theory holds that there are no ultimate truths, but rather that all truths are ultimately defeasible, in which
Mhm.
case that position itself is also defeasible.
Mhm.
Right. Whereas if you say that no truths are ultimately, or there are no ultimate truths, then you have the problem that you've just made an absolute statement. There
Yeah.
are no, which is to say all truths are not ultimate, which then, if you apply it to itself, then it fails.
Right.
Right.
So there are ways to wiggle out. Um, the problem is that it takes lots of interpretation, and from a performative or a therapeutic or a pedagogical point of view, that's not a bug, it's a feature. But you still have to interpret it in terms of pedagogy rather than um, the, I suppose, maybe one of the explicit and historically factual uses for Nagarjuna's writing, which is to say to be a response to the Vada tradition, be a
Yes.
response to the arguments that say Nyaya is making. Um, I presume
Well,
that a lot of this also was useful internally to the Buddhist traditions, in which case maybe the presumed purpose of it was pedagogy or therapy or whatever. But the problem is it also has this historical use as a refutation of other philosophical schools.
well, and they both went back and forth saying from first principles, you're not debating uh, according to the way we see the world by our principles, and then the Buddhists would say, well, we don't accept that as the the place to start making
Yeah, I mean,
agreements
I
about how to
suppose the
debate.
Jainas would say, well, if the Buddhist objection is that say the Nyayas are begging the question in favor of a particular definition of how the world is or what
Yeah,
how one ought to debate and so on. The Buddhists do the same thing. They beg the
yeah,
question
that's
in their
right.
own
That's what
favor.
I'm saying.
Right. And so that would be a jumping off point for saying, look, you both are right conditionally. There is
Yeah,
both a respect in which you're right. However, the problem is the fact that you want to make your either positions in the case of Nyaya or your objections in the case of
yeah,
Madhyamaka, you want to make these things absolute,
yeah.
right?
Well, and there's an interesting layer that is still fascinating to me about how the Buddhist position seems to be, at least expressed in this book, seems to be like we're pointing towards language that is conventional, but there's this ultimate that's just a practicality, right?
Hmm.
And so, and it's another way that they kind of maybe wiggle out of these accepting the terms, the same perspective in the debate in the
Yeah,
Vada tradition.
yeah, yeah. I think that we should probably get into the outline because I have a kind of detailed analysis of that specific issue.
Cool.
I guess I'll say it like this. You know, depending on what we mean by knowledge, what it means to know something, um, there are certain knockdown arguments that could go either way, but it really does end up depending on what you mean, uh, what it means to know something. And so I think that well, we should just go through the outline to get some of the details on that. But that's going to be one point of contention. Another way to look at it, however, is this. It's kind of a technical adage, but it's a great adage. And I don't know if there's a non-technical. There's probably some non-technical version of this, but I think Fred Dreiske is the guy who first said this, but you can find the same kind of idea in a lot of different philosophy. He says, and I'll explain what these terms mean in a moment. He says, one man's modus ponens is another man's modus tollens. Modus ponens is the logical conditional form where if A, then B, and you have A, then you get B.
Yeah.
Okay, modus tollens is equivalent However, the way that you derive modus tollens from, say, modus ponens is by negating the consequent. So if I say A, then B, but then I say not B, then I get not A. So one maybe obvious example of this, let's take a necessary truth like 1 plus 1 equals 2 or something like that. If 1 plus 1, then 2, but
Mhm.
not 2, so therefore not 1 plus 1,
Mhm.
right? And the thing is, the idea, the core idea in that adage is that two people can agree on the truth of the conditional. 1 plus 1 equals 2, sure, no problem, I agree. However, they can disagree about the truth values of the terms in that conditional. So if I say 1 plus 1 and then I just affirm that 1 plus 1 is true, I automatically get 2. And I can agree that if 1 plus 1, then you get 2. However, I can deny that 2, right? I can deny, you say 1 plus 1, then 2. Yeah, that's right. However, the problem is not 2,
Mm.
right? And so let's put this in a more fleshy version. Let's say something like, well, in fact, this is an argument that the Nyayas bring in response to Buddhist skepticism. Um, if there is no ultimate truth, then we cannot successfully navigate the world.
Mhm.
However, we can successfully navigate the world, so therefore it's false that all knowledge is ultimately conventional.
Yeah.
Or maybe there's a even more succinct version of this. Let's say something like this. Um, if you can't be sure that the external world is real, you can't be sure that you have a hand. However, why should I accept that that doubt is correct? Can't I just doubt the doubt? Can't I
Mhm.
doubt, like for instance, why should I doubt that the external world is real? Like for instance, the arguments that people usually bring for that have a sort of problem. Like for instance, let's say that sometimes you're dreaming, and when you're dreaming, you don't know that you're dreaming, and you take it to be real. And so
Mhm.
therefore, because sometimes you're wrong about what you take to be real, uh, we can doubt the existence of the external world.
Mhm.
Now, a response to that would be, yeah, but let's say that the external world is false. The problem is that we can tell the difference between dreams and what we take to be real,
Mhm.
right? And so, one thing you could say is, uh, look, there are certain aspects of our experience that we know directly through engagement, directly through experience, and these kind of thought experiments about whether the external world exists are uh, um, subsidiary or not nearly as certain, not nearly as direct as our
Yeah.
just immediate knowledge of engaging in the world. Like
Yeah.
most of the time, people engage in the world in a way that's really kind of like an expert level of engagement. Whenever you do anything, I mean, like writing on a sheet of paper or just getting up in the morning, or, the fact that even like a tree, which is not conscious, still expertly copes in its own particular way with its environment,
Mhm.
which
Yeah.
is to say there's a kind of knowledge, a sort of
That's the
procedural knowledge to
Nyaya
that.
position, right?
Well,
Just as-
I'm just trying to point up what's going on in this idea that, we can both agree that if the external world is false, that you can't be certain that you have a hand, for instance.
Mhm.
But I can also say, well, what am I more certain of? The fact that I have a hand,
Yeah.
or this kind of complicated, skeptical position that propositionally negates everything. I'm
Mhm.
I'm a lot more directly connected with the fact of my hand existing than
Sure.
all this kind of logical stuff. And so therefore I can say, okay, I can grant the skeptic that if the external world doesn't exist, that I can't be sure that I have a hand. And that might be true as a conditional. However, I assert that I am more certain about the existence of my hand than the doubt. So therefore, but I do have a hand. Therefore, skepticism about the external world is false.
Yeah, but it's I think I understand and follow all that, and it seems that's exactly kind of how the debate goes back and forth in some regards. It seems to me.
Mhm.
However, it seems to me that the Buddhist perspective is yes, we recognize there's a hand in front of you. It's just not ultimate reality.
Yeah, I understand that. What I'm getting at, however, is that if your purpose is to refute one way or the other, it's kind of an angry agreement,
Hmm.
right? So the point is that either the skeptic or the person who believes in the external world, they both agree on the terms of the debate, the terms of the conditional. They agree that the conditional is true. Um, However, the perspective or the whatever you want to take to be the starting off point of the conditional is going to give you something that looks like a diametrically opposed position. And to a certain extent, it is diametrically opposed. You both agree on the conditional, but
Hmm.
you know, the thing is like if you take a certain view of knowledge, it seems like it's impossible to overcome a skeptical challenge, right? Like, I say, well, are you sure that you have a hand? And then
Right.
um, if I take knowledge to require that kind of certainty,
Hmm.
propositional certainty, uh, knowledge about my own beliefs and their justification and all that kind of
Yeah.
stuff, then I can't overcome the skeptical challenge.
Hmm.
But there are other ways of thinking about what knowledge means beyond
Hmm.
just, you know, do you know your own reason for accepting whether you have a hand?
Hmm.
One way that I could define knowledge is, yeah, I know I have a hand because I use my hand all the time in my engagement with the world.
Right.
And so therefore, I'm much more certain about that
Yeah.
than a skeptical thought experiment.
Right. This is why some people just roll their eyes at philosophy.
Yeah, yeah. But the point is that you can roll your eyes without actually being able to explain what's wrong with skepticism,
Hmm.
right? And Here also the point is simply that, um, there is a kind of agreement. What is different is the perspective and what you take to be more certain or what you take to be um, maybe the definition of knowledge.
Like first principles.
Yeah, I mean, um, one thing about skepticism in general is that it does seem to require that uh, knowledge be basically propositional, right? That is to say, the skeptical challenges are never things like, you know, but do you actually engage with your world in a competent way? It's always something like, do you know
Yeah.
whether that's true, right? Which means that they're always asking for some kind of propositional justification, right?
Mhm.
But if you can say, look, knowledge doesn't require that kind of justification. Knowledge only requires that you be able to competently engage with your environment, the world, etc. Then skepticism can't overcome that,
Hmm.
Mhm.
right? And one upshot or one benefit maybe for that approach. Sometimes it's referred to as externalism about knowledge, this idea that what it means to know something um, has to do not with whether you have some sort of internal in your mind justification for the knowledge, but rather whether there's some objective thing out there in the world that underwrites knowledge. The objective thing out there in the world would be the fact that you can, or some organism or whatever, can engage with its world in a competent way. Um, that uh, for one thing, one benefit of that is that then you can extend knowledge to all sorts of beings that aren't constantly thinking in this propositional way,
Yeah.
right? So then, therefore, animals and maybe
Trees have knowledge.
pre-linguistic children or whatever
Mhm.
have knowledge, but it's not because they can justify to themselves
Yeah.
internally the reason for accepting a claim.
Right. It's not
Rather, they have
argumentative,
knowledge
right?
just because they're engaging in their world in a
Hmm.
competent way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they argue over these things in a way that you're saying they're in a way that seems like they were trying to become absolute. Like we know certain that your perspective is wrong or that ours is right, but they
Yeah.
keep going in circles because neither one will agree, even if it's in a debate format that they agree on. They keep seem to me like they keep circling each other and not agreeing on some of these basic ideas of how we, like you're saying, how do we define knowledge, or how do we agree on what is knowledge
Hmm.
or what is ultimate reality, you know?
Hmm.
Seems like
Hmm.
they can't come together on that, and that's maybe that's where the
Yeah.
Jainists come into play.
I,
Do they
I
develop
think
later?
everybody, and I think even the Jainas are probably guilty of this, although I don't know enough about them to say so. But certainly, like Nyaya and Madhyamaka, um, so like the defense of externalist accounts about knowledge that I've just given really only works if you're more interested in knowledge and not interested in certainty,
Yeah,
right? And the problem is that all of these different schools um, seem to conflate knowledge with certainty.
yeah, yeah.
So X counts as knowledge only if it is certain
Hmm.
knowledge, right? And that's where the Buddhist critique gets a foothold, right?
Hmm.
If the Nyaya approach, there are reasons to believe that Nyaya maybe isn't totally committed to knowledge as certainty, which maybe I'll show some examples of. But in any case, I think the most plausible surface reading of say the Vaiseshika Nyaya project is to give a you know account that establishes the certainty of our knowledge about the world, and it's because of that requirement of certainty that Nagarjuna can say, well, are you really certain?
Yeah,
Not that do you not know at all?
right.
But rather is what you know certain. Now, the thing is, again, if you're defining knowledge in terms of certainty, then if you can reject certainty, then you reject knowledge. But if you can come to a more kind of pragmatic or procedural understanding of knowledge, then a critique of certainty misses the point. If you can say you can know things even though they're not certain in this sense of being able to justify to yourself rationally why you believe X, Y, or Z, if you can nonetheless know something without that, then someone saying, ah, but you're not certain, you can't be certain about that.
Yeah,
The first party would say, yeah, so what? You don't need certainty for knowledge,
yeah.
right?
I think the Madhyamaka school also regards like pramana, like means of knowledge, also
Hmm.
as being empty.
Hmm.
So even the means that you're using
Hmm.
is empty. So I
Hmm.
feel like,
Yeah, and that's where like an externalist response would be able to maybe overcome that objection from Madhyamaka. So like um, so let's say that we're defining the justificatory power of a pramana, not in terms of the certainty that it underwrites, but rather in terms of its reliability in normal circumstances.
hmm
So in other words, like um, what what justifies perception as a mode of knowledge? Is it that you can give a complete and certain propositional justification for the knowledge that perception underwrites, or is it simply that um, most of the time, for most people, under a wide variety of changing circumstances, you get correct knowledge. So, like for instance, I'm looking at a tree outside my window.
hmm
Now, I suppose there are situations in which, even though I think I'm looking at a tree, it might be false that I'm looking at a tree, or it might be false that there's a tree out there. But under, a fairly generous understanding of normal conditions, as long as there isn't anything there in the situation that um, would counteract my ability to see this tree, there's no reason to accept that I'm not looking at a tree.
yeah,
They don't say that. The Buddhists don't say that though. I don't, that's not how I interpret it. They say, yeah, that is a tree conventionally. These are our words. That's conventional talk. It's functioning in the world of the tree, but it's just not ultimate reality.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the fact of distinguishing between two levels of conventional and ultimate, however, suggests that they are criticizing it in terms of its claim to certainty, right? So when you say it's not ultimate, really what you're saying is that knowledge claim is not certain.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly the divide. They don't look at it as, where it seems like the Nyaya position looks out in the world, observes, and makes inference from that, from practical knowledge. Let's say this everyday knowledge,
Well,
right?
okay, here's the problem. Um, Textually, the way that they object to the pramanas is that they say all of the justifications that you could give for the knowledge that, say, perception would enable fail,
Yeah. Hmm.
right? Which is to say, it fails precisely because the justifications, the propositions that you might use
Yeah.
in order to justify the truth that perception enables, those fail.
Yeah.
That's how they do it. That's how
Yeah. That's
their
right.
objection works, right? And so the thing is that that is a very devastating argument or, you know, critique or whatever, if you believe that knowledge requires that kind of internal justification.
Hmm.
However, what they don't do, um, at least with respect to how they critique, say, the Pramana theory, is, they're critiquing, they're specifically critiquing Pramanas as empty, as unable to provide knowledge.
Hmm.
Yeah, and that's
But
because
yeah,
they're saying that that which requires proving is being used as proof a lot of the
exactly.
times.
Yeah, yeah.
So like even with like perception, okay, how do you know you're looking at a tree? Well, I'm looking at it. Well, you're using looking terms to describe looking.
Yeah.
Exactly right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Um,
However, that only works if the perception itself is taken as a proposition that justifies a further proposition. However, what I gather from the Nyaya perspective on perception anyway is that it's not that it's not that perception as a proposition justifies perception. It's that there is no reason to doubt unless
mhm,
you can show that there's something special about this circumstance
Mm.
that makes perception as a means of knowledge fail, there's
Yeah.
no reason to doubt it. So that they shift the burden to the Madhyamakas to show that there's something wrong in this specific act of perception.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where and also, so in addition to this idea of there being like an external um, justification or an external thing that underwrites knowledge, the fact of being able to cope in the world objectively, whether I know why it's true or not, or why it's false or not. My knowledge of my own knowledge. So my knowledge of my knowledge
mm,
is not a necessary condition for this to count as knowledge. All
Hmm.
that's necessary is that I actually am interacting with the world.
Right.
Right. And so they shift the burden to the Madhyamakas um, in the following way. It's just like what I said before about doubting the doubt.
Yeah.
So this skeptical approach might say, yeah, but perception is being used to justify perception, so therefore it fails. Um, However, the Nyaya position is that no, perception works because it works in the vast majority of cases across people and situations and so on. And
Yeah.
unless there's some reason, some special reason that you can provide that shows me that it's failing in this precise situation, I doubt your doubt,
Right.
yeah.
right? And I think that the aspect of the particular is really important here as well,
Hmm.
right? If you remember reading or in my outlines, this idea that the Nyaya syllogism has 5 parts, and one of those parts, I think it's the third, is always a concrete specific example,
Hmm.
Uh-huh. Right.
right? And there's this idea that abstract reasoning about general cases isn't sufficient for knowledge. You always have to ground it in some precise, specific example
Yeah.
uh, that enacts the general rule.
Yeah. Perceptual realism, I think they call it.
So,
Yeah.
I think that that's the way that they would respond to skepticism about pramanas, right?
Yeah.
The pramanas, there's
Yes.
no reason to think they don't work,
Oh
right?
yeah.
Right.
Um, Unless you can show that the lighting conditions are strange, or I have an eye injury, or maybe I'm dreaming, or whatever. Maybe there's something that you could bring to the argument in this specific case that would make me accept the doubt. But otherwise, why should I doubt? It works all the time.
Right.
Yeah. I wonder if the Madhyamaka school, if they, the argument that they're using is that there's no qualitative difference between a hallucination and like a real world experience, right? Which is interesting. If they, I'm not saying that, I don't know, I'm just like using like a hypothetical
Yeah,
point of view here. But yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I don't know. Like, if they took that position, I feel like it's sort of a contradiction because they're prioritizing um, subjectivity or whatever, right? Like, if they're saying, "Oh, there's no qualitative difference between a hallucination and a real world, like a real experience of a tree or whatever,"
mhm.
so then everything is like um, nothing's real, right? Because you can't make
Yeah, yeah. So that's I don't know. I presume that somewhere in, Nagarjuna's writing, that claim is probably made because it's a fairly common type of argument. You see it in a variety of traditions. This idea that sometimes we're dreaming, and in those dreams we take that to be real. Now, that only works as a criticism of knowledge as certainty,
yeah,
right? Because sometimes when you're dreaming, you feel certain that it's real.
right,
It doesn't really work as a global type of skepticism, though, a
right,
general skepticism, because of the obvious fact that we can tell the difference between what we take to be real and what we take to be a dream.
yeah,
And skepticism is pretty good at deflating certainty, but it's pretty bad at uh, presenting a positive
Yeah.
account of why it is that when we take experience to be real, it shows up to us as real.
hmm,
It's not hard to imagine a totally competent, um, intelligent being on some alien world or something that engages with its world in a particularly, competent way and so on, and yet also doesn't take it to be real.
hmm,
But the fact of our experience is that it immediately shows up to us as real. And so the
yeah,
skeptics have to give an account of why that's the case,
right,
right? If they want to have a global type of skepticism that can undercut all claims to knowledge, not just claims to knowledge as certainty.
hmm, hmm,
It's also interesting. I just looking through some of my own notes on this. I found this one little quote here from the book. There is always a burden of establishing another particular instance within the Nyaya logical framework that is missing in the classic Aristotelian syllogism.
Correct.
Thus, one can say that the Nyaya inference places a much greater emphasis on particularity,
Mhm.
involving an argument from one particular case to another particular case via a universal statement, whereas its Aristotelian counterpart is an argument which moves from the universal to the particular on a purely
Mhm.
formal basis. It
Mhm.
seems like they're arguing from like premises not based on they're just basically arguing in their mind about concepts instead of like tying that
Who are they in that sense?
Aristotelian logic instead
Yeah.
of tying it to their lived experience.
Yeah, I
yeah,
mean, that's false. That's not a good characterization of Aristotle for a few reasons. But in any case, I mean, the
Oh,
the the big difference, however, is the question of what validity amounts to in an
yeah.
argument. Um, it is possible to have a valid Aristotelian syllogism where all of the premises and the conclusion are general claims.
Okay.
It's funny because like the most kind of tried and true example is not of that form. for instance, all humans are mortal. Socrates is a human, therefore Socrates is mortal.
Yeah.
Both the second premise and the conclusion are particular claims about
Yeah.
Socrates.
Right.
But you could say something like, um, all dogs are mammals, all chihuahuas are dogs, and therefore all chihuahuas are mammals. And in that case, all of the claims are general, they're universal. So that's an example, perhaps, of a valid form of reasoning that doesn't require a particular claim.
Okay.
And that's in Aristotle. And what they're saying about Nyaya is that, and what I gather from listening to the podcast and stuff, is that actually this was a point of contention in Nyaya itself. Some people wanted to move more towards a three-part syllogism. Um, so there was some debate about whether you actually need five parts. I mean, for one thing, the first sentence is always identical to the last sentence. So
Mhm,
you need
mhm.
both, right? But it does really turn on the function of the concrete example in the Nyaya syllogism if you need that concrete example for the syllogism to be valid. Then that's different from Aristotelian logic, in which case you don't need necessarily to have a specific claim. Although there are plenty of syllogistic forms in Aristotle that do use particular language or even specific individual language, like Socrates is one thing, right? Um, but the point is, in Aristotle, you don't need to have that individual
I
claim
see.
for it to be valid. And at least in some authors in the Nyaya tradition, you do need that grounding in a concrete, specific example.
Hmm.
Now, the point also that should be made here is that in addition to the concrete example, you also need a general rule.
Hmm.
So I don't remember the Sanskrit name, but when they say that there's smoke on, or I should get it exactly correct. I think they say
The
uh,
hill has fire
the
because
hill
it
has
has smoke.
fire because it has smoke.
Since whenever it
Wherever
has
you
smoke
have
has
smoke,
fire,
you have fire, like in the kitchen,
like in an oven. Yeah.
right, or whatever, right? But
Yeah.
the point is, within that premise that has the concrete example, they're also giving the universal rule. Whenever you have smoke, you have fire, just like in the kitchen.
Hmm.
So it's kind of like a two-part thing where you both give the general rule and then you show some evidence that that rule obtains. And presumably, I don't have an example of this in the outline, and I don't think they give this in the book, but in the podcast they were talking about how you can also reason from the absence of something. So, for instance, you never see smoke at a lake, right? So therefore, because of that absence, um, you can make a valid inference. But the point
Mhm.
is that there is a general rule that's given, either affirmative or negative. You always see smoke with fire, you never see smoke with water. And then you give an example, like in the kitchen, like at a lake.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And so there's this kind of two-part structure to
Yeah, that's true.
the
I can see what you're
reasoning,
saying.
right,
Hmm.
which grounds it in actual experience.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that whole thing about the hill and the fire and the oven didn't quite make a lot of sense to me, actually. It seems
Why
like
is
a
that?
weird example.
Why
Why
is that
not?
an example? Yeah.
What's that?
What's weird about it?
Well, because so I say this hill has fire.
Mm,
Next one, that was the statement. Because it has smoke was the reason.
mm,
Okay. Hill has fire. We see smoke, so it must have fire, is what I'm getting from that, right?
yeah.
We see smoke, this hill has fire. Since whatever has smoke has fire, for example, an oven, uh, because we know from another experience, maybe, right?
Well, we know from two sources, the
From
general
the
rule
from
and the concrete example.
from what?
We know from two sources here.
Yeah, there's other example.
From the general rule, whenever you've got smoke, you've got fire,
Yes.
and from the example, like in an oven.
Yeah, so they use two examples.
No, one is a general rule and one is an example.
Okay, general. Then the hill has smoke, which is associated with fire. That's the application. Therefore, the hill has fire.
not only is smoke associated with fire, fire is a necessary condition and presume also a sufficient condition for smoke.
Okay. Yeah, that's
Well,
making more
in other
sense.
words, whenever, yeah, it's both necessary and sufficient, right? So whenever you've, well, actually, that's not right. It's not sufficient. Smoke is not sufficient. Smoke is a sufficient condition for fire. Fire is a necessary condition for smoke. Whenever you have smoke, automatically you've got fire because
Mhm.
I presume the general rule they're giving is that fire is the only thing that produces smoke.
Mm.
However, not all fires produce smoke, like on a candle.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Right. So that's why it's whenever you've got smoke, you've got fire, like in an oven. But it's not valid to say whenever you've got fire, you've got smoke, but
Right.
there's a candle. You've got fire, but not smoke, right?
Yeah.
So the idea here is that they're giving the general rule, which actually has the function of laying um, uh, the sufficient conditions for the claim. If you've got smoke, necessarily you've got fire. That's the general claim.
Hmm.
And then they say, see, just like in the oven.
Yeah.
Mm. Seems like they're trying to come up with a sort of logic that holds form and content together at the same time or prioritizes both on an equal level. Um, right. And we kind of spoke about like Hegel's
Yeah.
turn with logic
Mhm.
um, and his critique of form, like logic that only emphasizes on form and not content.
Mhm.
And it seems like maybe that's what they're here.
Yeah, I
Um,
wonder because it's kind of interesting because you could express the um excuse me, you could express the Nyaya five-part syllogism like with sentence letters or something. It's just that one of the sentence letters will be the concrete example,
yeah,
right? So then it's still just formal. You
yeah.
don't know which concrete example. The concrete example has to, I suppose, follow from the general rule.
Mm,
So then you would have something of the form. Let's say it's like the first claim is A, and then the second claim, the second line is B, and then the third line is if C, let's see. Um, if A, yeah, it's interesting because here, the if you've got the concrete example, then you've got the general rule. So that's how the conditional would work.
mhm.
Yeah,
Um,
I think when I was saying it was confusing, it just seems more streamlined and then in how the Aristotelian syllogism would put three components because in this statement I had to like, infer that smoke is always a sign of fire. They don't really say that. Um, I
yeah,
mean,
so that I think is probably going to be a place that a pramana plays a role, right? Because the way that you know that is that um, whenever you encounter smoke, you encounter fire, and
yeah, so right,
nobody has ever encountered smoke without fire.
right. Exactly. No, it makes more sense now. I'm reading it a second time here.
Yeah, I mean, one thing about it. So,
It just
this
seemed clunky to me in a way.
the Nyaya approach seems clunky.
Yeah,
Well,
just something about it. Yeah.
it's certainly, yeah, it's less streamlined than Aristotle, right? Because it's two extra lines and so on, and may the thing about Aristotle, so there is actually a suppressed premise, though, in say all humans are mortal. Socrates is a human. Socrates is mortal. Well, I mean, how do you know that all humans are mortal,
Yeah. Right.
right? Except by definition.
Right.
If you define, I mean, that is actually both human and mortal come from burial and death. Humando means to bury.
Okay.
Like when you exhume a corpse, that
Yeah.
hume part of it is burial. And
Oh
that's
yeah.
the root of human, that
Yeah.
which is buried.
Right. Interesting.
So, I mean, maybe by definition, you know, you really only bury in the sense of a funeral burial. You only bury things that can die.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can only have funerals for things that can die. So there, by definition,
Right.
if you're having a funeral, it's something that can die.
Or if a little kid has a funeral for their stuffy, it's just
Yeah, I mean, I guess we would say
performative.
yeah, exactly, or performative in the sense of not real.
Yeah.
The thing that's tricky about the term performative in like speech act theory is that performative means that it is real, right?
Oh,
Like if I say that I promise you to pay $5, that's performative in the sense that that obligation is actually a fact now.
yeah, sure.
Whereas when we talk about like performative rage or something, we mean that the rage isn't real,
Yeah, right.
just a pretense.
Right, right.
Yeah, but you're right. I mean, we could say, well, but that's not actually a funeral because you can't really have a funeral if what funeral means is a ceremony for the dead.
Yeah,
The stuffed animal was never alive, so it can't be dead. So,
yeah,
so I mean, like in that case, right? I think the book maybe illegitimately says this about the Aristotelian syllogism that you could only know that humans are mortal by observing if every human you've ever encountered dies at some point.
yes,
Or it's also the case that as a term, human means that which can be subject of a funeral,
yeah,
right? So then by definition, all humans are mortal,
yeah.
right? In which case you don't need the observation of whether or not humans die
Hmm.
because
Well,
you
it's but you're right. It starts with something it's clearly established to them. It's
yeah, I
clearly
mean that the
established.
thing about general rules like that, abstract rules, is the only kind of truth that they can establish is definitional truth.
Yeah,
They can't establish observational truth,
right.
right?
Well, this is what's so interesting about the modern society is like people not agreeing on the facts. You know,
Well, can you
some
say that again? Sorry,
facts.
I coughed in the middle of what you were saying, but
I
go
was
ahead.
just saying, in modern society right now, when people can't agree on the facts,
Yeah.
they can agree on how to use the, you know, obviously you can disagree on how to use the facts or maybe what the facts add up to or like analysis of the facts. But when they can't agree on the facts, that makes it really, really difficult to have any constructive argument.
Yeah, I mean, I take it that the larger problem is that people can't agree on the interpretation of facts because there are certain facts that, yeah, maybe every once in a while Donald Trump denies that he had a meager audience turnout or something. Yeah, okay. But most of the time, like I go on the conservative subreddit quite often just to see like
Yeah,
how they process these national tragedies and stuff. And
yeah,
they all accept the same facts, but they draw completely opposite conclusions. And it's exactly this situation that I was describing of, one man's modus ponens is another man's modus tollens.
sure.
They agree that if X happens, then Y would be the consequence. However, they disagree about what is true.
Yeah.
But not because they disagree or they're being illogical or whatever. It comes down to the way that they're interpreting what the facts amount to.
But they also just disagree on facts. Like they'll say, I mean, with Donald Trump in particular,
Yeah.
like, did he
Sometimes
sign
they
it?
do.
Is it his signature? That's not his signature.
I know. However, even that would be a disagreement about the interpretation of a fact. They don't
Uh,
disagree that everybody's looking at something,
hmm.
some
Okay,
squiggle. Yeah, there's a
I see.
squiggle there. How do you interpret it? Oh, it's Donald Trump's signature. Oh, it's not Donald Trump's signature.
Yeah.
Right. But
Okay,
they
that's
don't
interpretation.
disagree about, I mean, sometimes they do. I grant that sometimes Donald Trump
He
says,
says, I
oh,
never said that. Oh, well, here's evidence that you said that.
right, sure. He does that quite often.
Yeah.
The reason I don't think that that is such a big problem is that it's easy to overcome. What's not easy
Ah.
to overcome is the difference of interpretation, right?
Where,
Like
well, and my point was what's maddening about modern society is that it seems not easy to overcome right now. That you talk to somebody on the street that likes Donald Trump and they'll say that he never said that. It's for I mean, if
sure. I mean, and then
you
you
wanted a
play
court
the
of law, maybe it's
yeah,
easy to
then you
overcome.
play the recording of him, and then they say, oh, it's
Yeah.
AI, etc.
Yeah, exactly. It's just
Then
it's
you give them a
maddening.
preponderance of evidence, and
Yeah.
eventually they will accept that they have
Yeah,
actually
okay.
seen this, but then they'll say, oh, but there's an excuse for it.
Yeah, that's
And
right.
that's where the interpretation
I see.
is
I
the sort of
see.
thing you can't
Yes.
overcome,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
It's um it's
Sure.
true. It's true that people, lie in order to obscure the facts and so on. But in general, like how do you overcome or how do you gain agreement on I don't know. I was thinking about this with the Charlie Kirk thing, right? Where it's like it is pretty awful what happened.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I was always sort of interested that, like, on all the news reports that I saw, they never actually played clips of him talking because if they had, he would just look like a monster. Because like it's true that he always debated people and he wasn't being violent. And I went on the conservative subreddit and they're all like, this is, the leftists didn't want to have reasoned debate. They only understand violence. But the point is that what Charlie Kirk was doing wasn't exactly reasoned debate either. It wasn't violence, that's true.
Yeah.
But it was like the most bad faith,
Yeah.
dishonest approach to
Yeah.
public debate that you could
Yeah.
imagine. I mean,
Sure.
and so it's like, and that's why I gathered nobody's actually playing the clips of him speaking because, like, certainly, saying things that people disagree with is not a justification for murdering that person. Obviously not. But the point also is that when we're trying to interpret like what he was doing as a public activity, was he really engaging in good faith, open discourse?
No.
Or exactly, right? And so it's like,
This is my point. It's
however,
very
that's
maddening, the
that's
modern
that's the
world.
interpretation. That's the interpretation that
Yeah. Yeah.
one
The
size
modern,
takes.
yeah.
So it's like, oh, you don't like open discourse? Well, no, I do. It's just that it's not actually open discourse because,
Yeah.
I was watching the conversation he had with Gavin Newsom, and they were all just talking at the same time as each other.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there was no like leeway or
Yeah.
given or whatever. It's just like this constant confrontation of ideas,
Loudest voice in the room wins.
or the most continuous voice. Right.
Yeah.
Like there's I don't know how these people breathe because it's like it's
Yeah.
constant like
So much of the modern information media is like that now.
yeah.
So much of it is. Yeah.
Anyway, I mean, we're getting maybe a bit far from where we want to be.
Sure. Okay.
Uh, um, Indian philosophy, ancient Indian philosophy. But I think that yes, one problem perhaps that you're seeing here that's not that different from say what's going on today is maybe the commitment to absolutes, right? This commitment to an absolute position as being the only type of truth that's available or the
Yeah.
type of
Yeah.
knowledge that's available, right? I think that this is a place where social norms play a big role.
Mhm.
Like if you just take, I don't know anything about, first century CE India. I'm sure there were lots of like hatred and all this, stuff that's similar to today. However, just the very existence of a social norm, reasoned debate where you try to be fair.
Mhm.
Now, then you could always ask, yeah, but is that the best way, or is that true? Is it true that you need to have that? It isn't really ju self-justifying. It's just so reasoned debate as a social practice just is justified based on its consequences,
Mhm.
right? Um, it deters violence. It enables a sort of mood or convention of charity and so on. And it may be that that's all conventional. However, the consequences are valuable, right?
Yeah.
And so that's a place where, you know, independently of who's right or who's wrong or what's true or what's not true, the very existence of reasoned debate as a social norm is valuable
It's
because
like
of,
fairness in sports or anything else.
yeah.
Yeah.
In any case, let's let's maybe go through a few things. I mean, we've covered most of the important stuff in this
I
outline.
had a couple questions that
Back in
came
the
up. I don't know if you I don't know when.
Well,
What was
maybe
your
we
point
can
that you made? Yeah.
finish out talking about Nyaya before moving to
Sure.
Nagarjuna. Were your questions more oriented towards the Nyaya stuff or more oriented towards
Well, it's just in the reading. I mean,
oh,
I
okay.
just
Yeah,
put
go
some
ahead.
stuff and read that I was like, I don't quite get this. Maybe
Yeah.
maybe whenever.
Well, maybe ask the question, and if I think there's a better time to answer it, we'll
Okay,
hold it.
in some part, they're talking about the Nyaya response here, and some later materialists, such as Pernandra, 7th century,
Mhm,
accepted the validity of inference so long as it remained verifiable by sense perception. They're
mhm.
talking about that, and then it says the sentence, in the West, inferential reasoning is always seen as grounded in perception and the activity of the mind. In the West, this has been described as the fallacy of psychologism.
Yeah.
That is the mistake of seeing the formal processes of logical reasoning as relating to mental events rather than the structure of language or reality itself. I just wanted you to unpack that a little bit for
Okay,
me.
sure. You want to try unpacking that, Sandus, since you've spent a little bit of time?
No, no, go ahead.
What he's getting to there is essentially a distinction between different things that we might mean by justification
Uh-huh.
or different sources of justification, right? Okay, so like in Kant, and maybe this is a place that you can kind of pivot, Sandesh. In Kant, Kant talks about, for instance, different sources of motivation, causality and normativity.
Okay.
Sandesh, what's the difference between causality and normativity?
Oh, I actually don't know this.
Oh, you don't know?
Causality and normativity.
Yeah, okay.
Oh, I mean, well,
First of all, what's
it's
normativity? What is normativity?
something that's true based on convention,
No,
or
no, that's the
no.
way people often use that term. That's not what it means in philosophy generally. Maybe take some notes because this is a central philosophical concept that is a little bit involved, but
Hmm.
so, Matt, if you want to write some stuff down, this might help.
Yeah.
Normativity is often used. Uh, so we could put it in these terms, maybe. Sometimes people distinguish between descriptive normativity and evaluative normativity.
Hmm.
Descriptive normativity is like what you were describing, Sandesh, which is it's the way things often happen, maybe most of the time happen.
Mhm.
So, for instance, most of the time people lie to each other. Most of the
Mhm.
time people have false beliefs,
Mhm.
right? So it's normal to have a false belief because lots of people have false beliefs, and most of the time somebody somewhere has got a belief that's false,
Uh-huh.
right? That's descriptive normativity.
Hmm.
Evaluative normativity is the type of normativity that philosophers usually just refer to as normativity, in an unqualified sense. When I say normativity, I usually mean um, evaluative normativity.
Hmm.
Evaluative normativity holds that even though X might be the case most of the time or even all the time, from the point of view of evaluative normativity, X can still be wrong.
Uh-huh.
So, for
Hmm.
instance, let's say the Nazis won the Second World War and they establish a culture in which, whenever you encounter someone of an undesired race or whatever social background, the normal thing to do is kill that person.
Mhm.
If it's and let's say that they conquered every country on earth and they put that legal practice into effect, if it's still possible to say, yeah, even though that's what normally happens, it's still wrong, then you
Yeah.
have a difference between the evaluative normativity and the description normativity,
Yeah, okay.
right? Okay, so now when I'm talking about normativity, that's what I mean, that evaluative normativity,
Okay.
the capacity for a mental state, a sentence, an action to somehow be wrong, to somehow be
Yes.
ill-fitted. Here's one big distinction between causality, as say a motivation or a justification, and normativity as an evaluate or as a motivation or justification. Um, you cannot violate causality. It is impossible to violate causality. If
Mhm.
I let's say that I'm on a roof and I think, you know what, I'd like to violate causality, so I walk off the roof
Mhm.
expecting that I won't fall. There is no way that I can violate causality, right? That is to say, even if I learn how to fly, I'm not violating causality. I have found some way to perform an action that's compatible with causality. It's just my previous understanding of causality was incomplete or something, right?
Mhm.
But you can't actually violate causality.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Like I
Yeah.
often go back to what's that
If
guy?
you can, you redefine it.
Well, by definition, causality means a uh,
Reason.
law-like regularity in nature, right?
Okay.
The idea is that magic is impossible precisely because it violates causality.
Mhm.
Is that clear? Right? Like real magic. Like I summon a rabbit out of thin air. If that really happened, um,
Yes.
you could say that that violates causality, and so therefore magic's impossible. Or you could say, oh, what you did wasn't actually magic. It's just that our understanding of causality was incomplete.
Yeah.
Is that clear?
Yeah.
Yes.
But magic understood as the violation of causal laws is impossible.
Hmm.
Okay, here's the thing that's different about normativity. You can, in fact, very often do violate normativity.
Yeah.
If, for instance, I add 3,926 to 5,747 and I get the wrong answer, I have violated normativity because there is a right answer and I got the wrong answer.
Right.
Right? Or if I say, for instance, that the Nazis were right, we should just kill people. If there is a fact of the matter about that, that one's more tricky because it's a moral claim. But if there is a fact of the matter about whether it's wrong to just arbitrarily kill people, then even though the Nazis are telling me that it's the normal thing to do, they're wrong.
Hmm.
The very capacity for them to be wrong suggests that there is a different kind of justification at work here. It's not causal because you could give a complete causal account of society where people are just completely determined and maybe, society is a very complicated natural phenomenon, but at least in principle, it's possible to give a complete naturalistic, which means both physical, chemical, but also psychological
Ah.
account from the point of view of causality, from the point of view of natural regularity, that explains why the world is such now that the Nazis are killing people.
Hmm.
So that is psychologism. This idea that what people do is all basically just causal.
Uh-huh.
However, most philosophers reject that. Most philosophers think that we also have this other source of motivation, reasons for doing things, right? So like if I can give a reason why it's wrong to kill somebody for no reason, for no but obviously there by definition, if it's wrong to kill somebody for no reason, then I can give a reason because that action was done for no reason, and if everything requires a reason, then that's obviously going to be wrong. But like for instance, if I can give a reason why it would be better to um, abolish private property or something, or if you, in fact, if you can give a reason for anything, there is within that conception this idea that um, it ought to be the case that you either do the right thing morally or that you get the right answer in a math problem or whatever. It ought to be the case. However, it's certainly possible and quite usual that that ought is violated.
So that's the fallacy of psychologism.
Psychologism basically is just holding that all human activity, all human thought,
Yeah.
all of society is essentially reducible to the causal laws of nature,
Yeah. Okay.
right? And
Uh-huh.
the idea here is that what is distinct about, say, philosophy that says, in addition to causality, people also act based on reasons that aren't ultimately causal because it's possible to violate reasons,
Yeah.
then it's supposed to show that a natural account is not sufficient for explaining all human activity,
Uh-huh.
right? So the fallacy of psychologism here is essentially saying that um, everything, even like when, so like it would be possible. Right now, we're talking about philosophy and we're talking about reasons and justification and so on. And then maybe some biologist comes along and says, "Oh, look, even though you think that what you're doing is talking about logic, what ought to be the case, and so on, it actually just so happens that your brains are firing in a certain way that is predictable, that is describable in terms of natural laws. And you might have the false belief that what you're doing is acting based on reasons, but actually it's just your brain firing in a particular way.
Mm.
So that would be psychologism, that logic is ultimately reducible to physical causality.
Hmm.
Uh-huh.
right. That's another way of getting at it. So
When somebody says love is just this chemical things going off in your
sure.
body,
Yeah,
is
that
that
that would also be a maybe fallacious psychological approach to love. If we think that love is anything more than just the tingles you get, you know, on your various nerves and whatever when you feel in love or something. If love also has all sorts of evaluative and moral prescriptions about things you ought to do if you love someone or things you ought not to do if you love someone, then that is meant to show that love as a phenomenon isn't ultimately reducible to just biochemical
yes,
processes, right?
right. Okay, thank you.
What was the
Mm.
context there again? Who was being accused of the fallacy of psychologism?
Well, this was just in a I mean, I copy paragraphs and then try to reduce them a little bit, like with the most important points that are new to me. And this was, okay. It basically said the Nyaya response is to suggest that the fault lies here with the example used and not with the inferential process itself. Later materialists, such as the Punandara, 7th century,
Mm,
accepted the validity of inference so long as it remained verifiable by sense perception.
mm,
This ruled out speculations about transcendent realms and other worlds beyond the empirical realm. We
mm,
should bear in mind, however, that ancient Indian logic never developed a purely formal structure.
mm,
Inferential reasoning is always seen as grounded in perception and the activity of the mind. And then
mm.
it says in the West, this has been described as the fallacy of psychologism, that
Yeah,
is the mistake of seeing the formal processes of logical reasoning as related to mental events
yeah.
rather than to the structure of language or reality itself.
So the claim here is that certain traditions in Western philosophy would accuse the Nyaya insistence that all normative claims
Yeah,
are ultimately justified by physical causal claims. That means perception, for
yeah.
instance, right? Um, and so that's why he brings that idea of psychologism. And then what he says is I guess the reason why that's not a good criticism is that there was never really a clear distinction in Indian philosophy between normativity and causality.
Hmm.
Mm.
It was kind of they never explicitly say X, Y, and Z are causal motivations or justifications, and A, B, and C are normative.
Hmm.
It's kind of there in a implicit way, but not in a way that's spelled out so much so that they are obviously and necessarily guilty of psychologism. That's what he would say, I
Well,
think.
and they basically make this point that within the ancient Indian traditions, a purely formal or deductive logic would be seen as dangerously divorced from empirical reality. In other words, I read that as they really wanted to tie things to their experience
Yeah,
of the world.
yeah. One thing that I don't like about this book, and it's a fairly typical problem whenever people are doing kind of comparative philosophy or maybe any kind of comparative study between cultures or whatever, is there's often two dangers that there's a kind of essentialism on both sides. There's an essentialism about what the non-Western thing is, and there's also an essentialism about the what the Western thing is. Because generally, depending on your perspective, if you're more in like the ethno side of things, you generally most people don't have very deep knowledge of Western traditions. And so they assume that, oh, all Western traditions are all about logic and discount sense perception and so on. But actually, there's a huge tradition in the West that is very close to this sort of perception-based, uh,
Yeah.
you know, nature-based idea and so on. And so it's like the thing is that the what people get wrong about the Western tradition is actually it's similar to what they get wrong about other traditions, but it's this idea that they misrecognize how many different theories have been put forward
Mhm.
in the Western tradition. Uh,
Yeah.
and it's I mean there's a certain amount of weight to the objection because you can talk about a predominant
Yeah.
strain in Western thought,
Right.
but the point is simply that, there's a lot of really contradictory viewpoints in the Western tradition, and so it's like it's not just one thing, one monolithic thing.
What I'm finding fascinating is the similarities. Like when I'm listening to these lectures on the pre-Socratics,
Yeah.
I'm making connections very generally, maybe, but between how the Buddhist perspective was about reality and how some of these pre-Socratics were trying to put their mind around reality. And you can see somewhat, they're not exactly the same, of course, but you can see
Yeah.
some sort of similarities or some sort of,
Right.
bridges
Well,
across some
and
ideas.
exactly that is maybe the problem of essentialism towards non-Western traditions. Very often, like let's say there's some argument that's made in some non-Western tradition, and you bring something like a Western style argument against it. It actually, and very often people would object by saying, "Oh, you're trapped in your Western perspective, and you don't, you're not
Yeah,
qualified to comment
yeah,
on this." It just so happens that at least in the Indian tradition here, you're going to find people within that tradition that make the same kind of
yeah, yeah,
arguments, and so
yeah.
it's like.
The materialists, for example,
Yeah, I mean, you can now. It's not to say that Charvaka materialism is
the
exactly the
same.
same thing
Yeah,
as like Democritus's materialism or whatever.
yeah. But you can see connections.
Yeah, but
You
there's
can
a
see them
general kind of
striving.
a general
Yeah,
kind of types of approaches, types of like moves in the game,
yeah.
in the
I
battle.
find that fascinating. It's really, actually, that's one of the coolest parts
Yeah,
of this
yeah.
for me.
That's why a few weeks ago, I think I mentioned that it's probably more constructive to just kind of bracket the East-West kind of thing. And it's best if you can, if one can, raise objections from the tradition that you're talking about. My
Yeah,
problem is I don't know the other tradition well enough, and so
yeah,
I can only find Western versions of this. As I
right.
know these other traditions better than I see other moves that you can make from within the tradition. But
Sure.
in general,
Yes,
it's not that.
somewhere in the book it said something like, or I think the author said something like, well, at the end of the day, they're all looking at the same thing, the same
Yeah,
reality.
in reality. Yeah.
Uh, yeah. And it's just, they're both looking at the same tree, but we can come up with like different
Yeah,
Yeah.
interpretations of how it is that the tree appears, or how do I know that it's a tree? But at the end
yeah,
of the
Yeah.
day, you're both looking at a tree, right?
yeah,
Yeah, that's what I was trying to suggest with both the modus ponens, modus tollens
yeah.
adage, but then also this idea that when discourse breaks down, the hardest part there, the hardest problem is interpretations, because
Mhm.
you can all agree on the reality, but what it amounts to is
Yeah,
the source
interpretation.
of conflict comes. And so, yeah.
Hmm.
Maybe we can, I don't know that there's much to say about the structure of debate. I don't think it's that interesting, although if you guys want to raise anything about the Vada
That's
tradition,
fine.
um, I guess maybe just really quickly, I guess there was some controversy about the, so there are three types of debate, Vada, which is this, I suppose the predominant type of debate, which is what I described as being fairly regimented, but also with an eye towards fairness, an eye towards being able to adequately express your opponent's position, all this good kind of stuff was in the Vada tradition. And then there were these other two traditions that the Nyaya accepted, the Jalpa, which is more about competition, more about winning, perhaps, and then the Vitanda approach, which is simply about dismantling your opponent's argument without necessarily giving any positive argument yourself. And apparently, there was some controversy over whether Jalpa and Vitanda should be accepted among the Nayas. The Buddhists both agreed that Jalpa and Vitanda weren't really valuable forms of debate. It was only Vada that was important. Um, so that was perhaps kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Maybe we can jump though into Nagarjuna, and in particular, um, I think it'd be interesting to talk about the tetralemma. Maybe one thing I'll say here before we jump into the tetralemma is uh, to talk about the two different kinds of negation that I don't remember the guy's name, Rueg or Rug, or however you say his name. He's talking about implicatory negation and non-implicatory negation. And the difference here is that in the normal type of logic that we use most of the time, classical logic, if I say something is false, that immediately applies that its opposite is true,
Mm-hmm.
right? So if I say, I don't know, it's false that I'm not holding a pencil, then it's true that I am holding a pencil.
Mm-hmm.
So that's implication directly from the negation. The negation always implies the truth of its opposite.
Right.
And what he says about Nagarjuna is that when Nagarjuna negates a position, he's doing it in a non-implicatory way. It's this idea that the negation does not immediately imply its opposite,
Mhm.
which means that it can be a completely negative position.
Just a game changer.
A game changer? What do you mean?
Well, doesn't he say it just puts like a almost like a bomb in their whole system of first principles? Is that what
Mm-hmm.
you're saying?
It depends on your perspective, I guess. I mean, if you think that debate is only constructive when you not only negate but also defend a position,
Mm-hmm.
then one could say it's not really throwing a bomb into the uh, debate structure. It's simply not a good debate because the
Mm-hmm.
person
Yeah.
can't defend a position, so therefore we shouldn't take them seriously, right? That
Yeah.
that would be a way that you could try to save the debate.
Right.
I compare this very much to dialectical logic in Hegel, but also in Adorno, in negative dialectics, and so on. This idea that whenever you're criticizing something, people often think that a response to the criticism is to say, oh, then you must believe the opposite of what you're
Mm.
criticizing. But you can then also turn around and say, no, I don't believe that either. I
Yeah.
don't
Right.
believe P or not P.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And there's some interesting logical consequences there. For one thing, what happens is that you don't get double negatives anymore, right? The negation of a negation is not the same thing as an affirmation,
Yeah.
right? And it is this kind of interesting position where you can levy criticisms um, without then pinning yourself to a positive position.
Mm.
Because the negation doesn't imply the truth of the opposite.
So in
Which
the case of you holding a pencil, if you said you are not holding a pencil, you are not.
let me say it this way. The pencil example is not great because it's not obvious what that means, but we do this all the time in the way we speak. Like for instance, let's say that I'm a Jain, and um, I believe that Nagarjuna is right to criticize, but he's not completely right because he's being too absolutist or something.
Mhm.
One thing I could say to Nagarjuna when he criticizes a position is I could say, well, you're not wrong, dot, 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 but you're not wrong doesn't mean you're right.
Yeah.
Even though
Right.
wrong is the negation of right, is the opposite of right, and I'm negating wrong. So on a classical logic perspective, that would mean if I say you're not wrong, oh, you're right. But
Mm.
actually, we do this all the time in language where we negate the opposite or we negate a negation. And the negation of a negation doesn't mean that the opposite is true.
Mm-hmm.
You're not wrong or you're not ugly doesn't mean you're beautiful or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's not false, doesn't mean it's true.
That dress on you doesn't look terrible, honey.
Exactly, right? So actually it's a fairly common kind of thing that we do in language where we negate something without implying that the opposite is true.
Yeah.
Um, and it's kind of interesting because there is a sense in which it evades. And
Yes.
like, you can get out of being blamed for being wrong if all you're saying is, well, you're not right exactly and you're not wrong exactly.
Yeah.
That's why I think the Jain tradition has this third truth value, inexpressible,
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
because it's not A or not A.
Mm.
It's both and neither and all this kind of stuff.
Are
Mm-hmm.
there practitioners of Jainism now?
Oh yeah,
Apparently, yeah, yeah.
Oh, okay.
You know much about the Jain community, Sandesh?
yeah. They well, yeah. I've met a bunch of people from the Jain community. They have, I mean, but I don't know. Like they're all like practicing it
Right.
stringently, but the really hardcore Jains, they, they wear the thing around their mouth so that they don't like swallow flies or mosquitoes. And it's like this whole thing about nonviolence. And
Oh,
yeah, and they always have that mask around their mouths, and they're, only dressed in like bare clothing, just like white. And
oh,
yeah.
Yeah, apparently their central figure, Mahavira, walked around naked, and like his immediate
Oh,
disciples walked around naked and stuff. So
really?
there's
Yeah.
yeah, there apparently there was like some historical debate about whether people should be naked as a vehicle for salvation, and if you take that to be the case, and you take it to be also the case that women are not allowed to go around naked, then women don't have access to salvation. And so
Yeah.
this was like a big controversy in
hmm.
Jain history, apparently.
Yeah. Yeah. And they don't eat onion, and they don't eat food that grows like in the ground and stuff.
Mhm.
Hmm.
They don't eat potatoes. Um, yeah, no garlic, no
I
onion.
wonder if they could eat um, what is it? Lab originated meat.
Probably
Like
not.
Do you know if they're like, if I mean, because religion gets at some point divorced from philosophy, right? From this kind of perspective that you were sharing earlier.
mhm.
Do you think that they're, do you know if they are like holding this perspective that we must hold all perspectives?
I'm
Or
not sure.
is it been really like divorced from that? And this is the set of practices we follow
Well,
now as a
I
Jain
do
is
know
some of
that
those.
like, 2000 years ago, that was the non-absolutism was
Yeah.
a huge part of what it
Yeah.
meant to be a Jain. I presume that that is still the case. I don't know that it's the case. Maybe Sanders knows more about that. I've also heard it said, although there are reasons not to accept this as true, but that non-absolutism is also a form of nonviolence. It's like a kind of intellectual nonviolence, right?
Mhm.
That you don't want to completely destroy anybody's position, but
Mhm.
rather you say, well, you're right, but not totally right, right? You
But
know.
then they come up with the things like women can't be naked. It's interesting. I mean, you can find,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't know enough about that particular
yeah,
controversy
yeah,
to
yeah.
say.
I don't know anything about it.
I just
Yeah.
know that that was a question that came up.
Interesting. Okay.
All right. Maybe we can talk a little bit about what's going on in the Catuskoti, the tetralemma, which is this fairly typical approach to logic that the Buddhist writers use. In fact, apparently it is originated by the Buddha himself. The Buddha in the Mahanadana Sutta uh, apparently says the following, which is a positive expression of the tetralemma. Um, he affirms four different types of feeling, or four different possibilities of feeling, that feeling is born of contact. With the arising of contact, there's the rising of feeling. And then what he says is feeling is of four kinds: pleasant, painful, neither painful nor pleasant, and both pleasant and painful. And here there's, because it's a positive expression of it, it is fairly, uh, has fairly wide scope. It encompasses all the different sorts of things that one might mean by feeling. And so it denies disjunction. It denies that if you have one, then you necessarily can't have its opposite. Um, Now, the thing is that's tricky about any of these kinds of aphoristic presentations is it's not really clear what it means to say that, for instance, uh, feeling is both pleasant, painful, and neither painful nor pleasant. And so that's where the interpreters have to come in and
Mhm.
explain what that could possibly mean. And there are a bunch of different ways of talking about it. Maybe he's talking about it in terms of respects, like fear or anger is painful, but it's also pleasant in a different respect from which it is painful, right?
It
Like
sounds like aspects of massage.
aspects of massage.
This massage is pleasant, painful. Neither pleasant
Yeah.
or painful, or both
Mhm.
pleasant and painful.
Yeah. I mean, I think he's trying to give a complete canvas of everything you can
Yes.
mean by feeling. Um, but it does seem like it's contradictory on one reading. Like, how can it be both painful, pleasant, and also neither painful nor pleasant?
Mhm.
Unless perhaps what he's trying to establish is that there are different respects within which it's painful and pleasant, but that those respects don't capture everything you could mean by
Yeah, right. Something that's
pleasure and all this
needed.
kind of
Right.
stuff.
That's how
And
I
so
read
that's
it.
maybe one interpretation of it. Um, there are reasons, however, to think that maybe that's not a completely adequate uh, understanding of what's going on, because I mean, it does seem like if they're neither painful nor pleasant, but also it makes more sense to say they're pleasant, painful, and both pleasant and painful. It's harder to say what exactly is
It just
being
seems, could it just be
canvassed
another,
by
like you're saying,
neither.
another
Yeah, I
catch-all
mean,
category?
the problem with the neither pleasant nor painful, however, is just that it's not really clear what that's referring to. It's like this
Yeah.
empty expanse or this
Mhm.
infinite expanse of what is not captured by pleasant and painful, but then it's
Yeah,
hard to
exactly.
say what it means if you're applying that negative predicate to feeling, what is all the other stuff that is otherwise than pleasant and painful and yet is captured in feeling,
Mhm.
right? Now, the reason I bring that up is just for historical interest, that apparently that is supposed to be a expression of this form that was made by the Buddha himself. But the more famous and more, I guess, usual expressions of this logical form are generally negative. It's not that you affirm all four possibilities, but rather that you deny all four possibilities. That's the way that Nagarjuna usually uses
Huh.
the tetralemma. And so if you go to the top, not quite the top, but where I have my initials, HH, the
Yeah.
lemma.
Interpretive traditions.
Yeah, so you've got the fourfold logical schema that is used in Indian philosophy, although it's mostly in Buddhism. It's particularly a Buddhist structure. So I put in a couple famous examples of this kind of thing in Mula Madhyamaka Karika when he's talking about interdependent arising, causation, etc. He says um, pretty much of anything, whatever, it is neither from itself, nor is it from another, nor from both, nor without a cause. Uh,
Mhm.
so here, what he's doing is negating that causality or origination comes from a thing itself. Nothing is self-caused, but nothing is other-caused either.
Is this in your
And
outline? Huck, I'm
yeah,
trying to find it.
yes, this is in my outline. It's on page 15 of the outline.
Okay. Okay.
Nagarjuna's critique of pramana theory is the top part of that, and then scroll down to the tetralemma.
Yes, I got it.
Okay. Right. So he's saying that nothing is self-caused,
Mhm.
nothing is other-caused, at least in its entirety,
Mhm.
but nothing is caused from both self and other,
Mhm.
and nothing is caused by neither self nor other.
Mhm.
And now we have to figure out what the hell that means.
Mhm.
How can you interpret it? So, and here's, by the way, one other thing that is not obvious just from this verse, but if you appeal to the context that he's writing in, generally, Nagarjuna accepts the law of non-contradiction. In fact, the way that he usually argues against Nyaya is to show that their positions are inconsistent because they take both, they take something to be true and they take its opposite to be true, and that's supposed to be inconsistent.
Hmm.
Mhm.
So that means that he accepts the law of non-contradiction. So it's not that he's saying that, oh, contradictions are true, something can be both true and false at the same time in the same respect. He affirms that that is a contradiction and so therefore impossible. So then you have to figure out what's going on here, where he says that it is, for instance, uh, um, neither. It is not the case that not P or not P. Just let me close that.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Um, yeah. So below that, I have well, I've given a couple other textual examples of this kind of move where he is denying what seems like all possible logical values, truth values, including the combinations or the disjunctions of truth values and so on. He has some famous criticisms about change and motion understood from the Nyaya perspective as change being something that arises from an agent. What I mean by that is simply, there's this concept that we've encountered both in the book, but when I was talking about Aristotle, that in order to have a concept of change, you have to have a concept of persistence through change. And so he wants to deny that too. And
Mhm.
that's what the second verse is attempting to do.
Mhm.
Um, because if there is an agent that's not changing, then it's distinct from the change. So that's what the first one does. What moves is not moving. What does not move is not moving. Apart from what moves and what does not move, nothing else is found, right?
Mhm.
So, it's this kind of strategy where it seems like he's denying all logical possibilities.
Mhm.
It's not P, it's not the opposite of P, it's not both P and its opposite, it's not neither P and its opposite,
Mhm.
right? Okay, so maybe we can go down to the modern interpretations because I think those are the most forthcoming
Mhm.
with respect to what's going on here. Now, last time I talked a little bit about, treating this kind of move maybe not as a proposition, but rather as a therapeutic speech act,
Yeah.
Mhm.
right? And another thing that I said with, where I was comparing him to Adorno is this idea that maybe the most adequate way of engaging with reality is not to ask what is true and what is false, but rather to engage in a way that's independent of truth and falsity.
Mhm.
And in
Mhm.
fact, most activities that people do have nothing to do with truth and falsity. It's
Mhm.
only specific uses of language where truth and falsity play a role. But the
Mhm.
vast majority of things we do are neither true nor false. They just happen,
Yeah.
Yeah.
right? And so that might be a way of interpreting this. A
Mhm.
few weeks ago, also, I talked about the category mistake approach.
Mhm.
Remember that, Sandesh?
Like the like virtuous quadrilateral, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So let's say that if, for instance, just to repeat what a category mistake is, a category mistake is where um, two concepts are brought together in a way that seems like they don't make any sense. Like if I say, a typical example is virtue is quadrilateral. And
Yeah.
then you ask, is it true that virtue is quadrilateral? Well, probably not. Is it false that virtue is quadrilateral? Well, no. Is it uh, both true and false, or rather, is it not the case that both uh, virtue is quadrilateral and not quadrilateral? And then you could say, yeah, because it's something other than that. But then the problem here is then you have to say, okay, well, if it's something other than, then how can it, um, uh, let's see, how can it, yes, then you would say that it's neither, it's not that it's both true and false, but neither is it neither true and false.
But
However,
this is becoming this is like implicatory negation though, right?
how's that?
Because if you say, well, if let's say I say virtue is quadrilateral, and then you ask me, well, is that true? And then I say no,
Mhm.
but you're assuming that I'm implicating the opposite. And then
Uh-huh.
you ask me another question, and then I say, no, it's not that. But what if I'm just saying it as a non-implicatory negation?
Yeah, right. Well, I think that is what's going on. It's non-implicatory.
Okay.
But were you saying that maybe there's a reason to think it is implicatory here?
Yeah, because if no, just like yeah, if you illustrate all the different negation possibilities or whatever,
Hmm.
then you're taking on a implicatory stance, right?
I don't think so. I think if we take that you can negate things without automatically affirming the opposite,
Uh-huh.
and then if you negate all four horns of this tetralemma, then it doesn't automatically mean that you're affirming anything,
Mm,
right?
yeah.
Yeah. So I think that that is one one presupposition that we have to take here, that the type of negation that is being used is not the type that immediately implies its opposite,
Mhm.
Mhm.
right? It's like saying you're not wrong, or it's not wrong that virtue is quadrilateral. It's not right that virtue is quadrilateral. It's not both right and wrong that virtue is quadrilateral. And then you'd have to say, but it's also not neither right nor wrong.
Mhm.
Virtue is quadrilateral,
Mhm.
right? That's the part that's a little tricky though, right? Like if it's something other than um, right or wrong, then it seems like it is hard to negate that it is neither right nor wrong,
Mhm.
right? Because in saying it's neither right or wrong, you're saying it's otherwise than right or wrong, but then you just negated that it's not otherwise that right or wrong,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And so that's a place where the category mistake uh, um, uh, interpretation maybe breaks down, because if by category mistake you mean that it's something like the form of an infinite judgment, it is otherwise than. It seems
Mhm.
like in negating the last one, it's not neither,
Mhm.
then then you're also negating the affirmation that it is otherwise than right or wrong.
Mhm.
Actually, I should say that sometimes he says something more like it is neither X or
Mhm.
Y, and sometimes it seems like he says it is not neither X or Y. In the
Mhm.
case where you say it is neither right or wrong, that's fine from the point of view of a category mistake, right? Because it's not right that virtue is quadrilateral. It's not wrong that virtue is quadrilateral. It's not both right and wrong that virtue is quadrilateral. And it's not the case that either virtue is quadrilateral or it's not quadrilateral, because it's something otherwise than truth and falsity.
Mhm.
But then sometimes, like in the first one here, when he's talking about depending arising, when he says not without a cause,
Mhm.
maybe I translated this incorrectly. Maybe it's not P or not P. But when you say without a cause, then you would say it's um, so if you say that P means caused by itself and not P means caused by another, and then if what you want to say is otherwise than caused by itself or caused by another is without a cause.
Mhm.
Does that sound right?
Mhm.
Then what
Yeah.
he says is not without a cause.
Oh.
So that's why I have not P or
Mhm.
not P.
Mhm.
Because without, I think, is saying neither. It's not neither P and not P.
Right. It's
Right.
not neither P or not P, right?
Yeah, which
Yeah.
then, yeah, so
Mhm.
then you've got the problem where the category mistake interpretation doesn't work.
Mhm.
Because if you by category mistake you mean it is neither P or not P, then he's just negated that that's true.
Yeah.
So there are a couple other interpretations down here. I think maybe as I said, it's possible that one way around it is to take the speech act therapy approach, in which case it's not really establishing the falsity of these things. It is simply modeling what it looks like to avoid attachment. The
Yep.
problem with that is that it doesn't, it's not really adequate to the granularity
Hmm.
of the language here, which is like really precisely logical and also comes from a context of rational debate.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it's like if you say, well, it's just therapy, it shows you how not to be
Mhm.
attached. Why go to the trouble of these really meticulous examples of negation?
Yeah.
That seems really superfluous for the task of simply showing what it looks like not to be attached.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah, in the podcast, there was one episode where someone asked, why do the Buddhists practice meditation if they don't believe in the self? Like, what's the
Mhm.
purpose of
Mhm.
meditating if, everything's empty and, you don't need to like
Mhm.
meditate,
Sure.
right? Um, yeah, and then the person sort of gave like an answer that was like, yeah, that's true, but also, it wasn't like convincing enough for me. And I was also trying to think about it, like, because it's such a big practice, and
Mhm.
um,
I
yeah,
mean,
I don't know
to
if you
an
understand.
extent, maybe you could, you know what Pascal's wager is?
No.
Pascal's wager is a thought experiment created by Blaise Pascal, which goes like this. Either God exists or God doesn't exist. If God does exist, or if God doesn't exist and you don't believe in him, the worst that can happen is nothing.
Mm.
Um, if God does exist and you believe in him,
Mhm.
then you get infinite reward. If God does exist and you don't believe in him, then you get ultimate infinite punishment. So
Mhm.
therefore, even though it may not be true that God exists, it's still rational on a probabilistic level to believe in God.
Mhm.
Because if God doesn't exist and you believe in him, no problem. If God doesn't exist and you don't believe in him, no problem. If God does exist and you do believe in him, great. If God does exist and you don't believe in him, oh no, terrible. So therefore, it's rational simply to believe in God, even though, there's not like any evidence or anything, just on that level. And I think maybe you could take a kind of similar approach to meditation.
Mm.
It's not that meditation establishes that there's a self. It's not that meditation establishes that there's not a self. It's that meditation, you know, if if you hold that all positions are defeasible, so you could be wrong about whether or not there's a self, and you think that if there is a self, then meditation will be great. If there's not a self, then meditation is just a slight waste of time, a slight inconvenience, but not that big of a problem. Then, even though you don't necessarily believe that there is a self or not a self, it's still rational to meditate.
Mhm.
The problem with Pascal's wager would seem to me like you could say that about anything, and then it'd be like, well, what do we decide to make these
Well, you couldn't
with
say
a
it about anything. You could only say it about things, the existence of which would entail some kind of reward or some kind of cost.
yeah, that's something you could say Donald Trump is God. Better believe it. Or you could say, I mean, what I'm saying is it's a little bit I like it. I like thinking about it. But then applying it to like the existence of God and then meditation and what else? How
Well,
many other
yeah,
things?
here's a bigger problem for Pascal's wager. Um, if it's possible that there are multiple gods to choose from, and all of them will punish you if you don't believe in them,
Yeah, then
then you have to figure out which one is the right God.
yeah, right. So I guess it's another way of
If
looking
you
at it too.
believe that there's only like this kind of binary possibility,
Yeah,
God exists or God doesn't exist. But if you have a wider range of
yeah,
possibility that,
yeah.
God exists. But the thing is like with God or with the self or whatever, there the question is simply, it's not that there's disagreement about any variety of selves you could choose from. Either the self exists or it doesn't. So that's why I think it is maybe um, relevant to the practice of meditation, even if you don't necessarily believe that there is a self or not. If you think that, well, if there were a self, then meditation would be good. If there's not a self and I meditate, then it's not a big deal.
Yeah, but then let's say you join a religious cult or something, and they say you need to do this, but you need to meditate, but then you also need to sacrifice a kitten on Fridays.
Mhm.
They just go through these things,
Yeah.
right? And they become like a number of things.
Okay.
I guess my point is that and it has to do with yourself and salvation,
Uh-huh.
and then at some point it starts to become meaningless. How if you can be applied almost anywhere? Is that
Well,
true?
you can't apply it anywhere. You can only apply it in contexts where something either exists or does not exist, and there's some further action
Yeah.
that is taken with respect to its existence or its non-existence
Right.
that yields benefit or cost.
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is
Right.
it could be I guess.
So like, I do really want to talk about the tetralemma, although it's
Okay, that's
we don't
fine.
talk about
That's
this.
fine. I just
But
was interested in that.
with with respect to cults, I suppose. Yeah, I mean, there is the problem that either the cult is right that
Yeah.
following what they say will give you absolute benefit in eternity, or it won't, and so on. So yeah, I mean, there is possibly the problem of maybe you have an evil god or something like that. But there, I think it really only that objection actually only gets a foothold when you have multiple possibilities to choose from
Yeah.
about the existence or non-existence. So, like for instance, even with the cult, what you're saying is not that there's only two options, either you believe in the cult or not, but rather, really, what you're asking is, should I follow this cult or should I follow some other set of
Hmm.
moral maxims and so on? Yeah, again, the point simply is that Pascal's wager does not establish the existence of God.
Hmm. Right.
What it tries to establish is given um, the possible existence or non-existence and possible benefits or punishments, that there is one more rational course of action than another.
Hmm. Yeah.
That's all it's trying to do, right? And so maybe that's a way of thinking about meditation. I don't know, maybe not. I'm just, kind of. I learned a good word this morning, eisegesis. Eisegesis means reading your own biases and beliefs into a text that might not share those beliefs.
Yes,
It's possible that
Well,
trying to apply or trying to apply Pascal's wager to meditation in Madhyamaka context is eisegetical. It's
could be,
eisegesis, but
but earlier on in a couple chapters ago, they did say that the Buddha and the whole Buddhist tradition did try to also establish healthy practices.
mhm.
And meditation could be just one of those very established healthy practices.
Yeah, but
Uh,
then we would want to ask, well, what establishes the healthiness of that practice, right?
yeah, what
Especially
I'm
if you
trying to say
don't
is
believe
why
in
do
the,
so many, the question is, why do so many people meditate today? It's a very well established healthy practice that goes back centuries to,
yeah.
you know, I don't know how much they're thinking about it, but
Yes. I I don't think that really is a response to the question about why meditate, if meditation is supposed to be
uh,
a therapy for the soul, but there is no soul.
that's true. That was the question originally.
Right.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, just the fact that people do it doesn't make a lot of sense. Unless there's some maybe belief that as conventional, it's really so like one way of looking at Pascal's wager is not that it establishes an ultimate truth about whether God exists or not. It simply shows that within a particular conventional set of practices, there's one more rational course of
Yeah.
action than
Yeah.
another, right? And so it doesn't establish the ultimate truth of whether God exists. But that's kind of irrelevant because given the understanding of what it means for God to exist and what it means to believe or not believe in God on a conventional level, um, again, that's why it's expressed as a wager, not
Yes.
as a proof of God's existence. It's like if you're at a casino and you have a game where you can choose to believe in God or not. And believing in God when God exists will give you billions of dollars, and not believing in God when God exists will make you lose billions of dollars. And either believing or not believing in God when God doesn't exist doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And it's obvious what to do in the casino,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Sure.
That's all it's trying to establish. But of course,
Yes.
that's all
Yes.
conventional. It's not establishing any ultimate truth.
Yes.
Except,
Okay.
I mean, there is a kind of ultimate truth to the rational structure of probabilistic reasoning. right? The structure of probabilistic reasoning has a kind of necessity to it.
Mhm.
It's just it doesn't establish an existence claim, right? It's not establishing an ontological claim about something existing or not. It is simply saying, given these possibilities within a kind of conventional rule of thumb way of behaving in the casino, there's one better course of action than another,
Yeah.
right?
Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, I do just want to. I know it's late. It's 11:35. Let's
Yeah.
just
We take off in 5 minutes, by the way.
okay. Well, let's maybe try to run through um uh try to run through one of the ways of thinking about the tetralemma. It's in the top bit here where Jan Vesterhoff, which was probably the person you were listening to in that podcast,
Mm.
Sandesh, was talking about meditation, I think.
Oh, yeah.
Talks about different ways of interpreting what's going on in the tetralemma. It still doesn't solve the problem of negating neither P or not P. However, if we take the tetralemma to be, it's not the case that P, it's not the case that not P, it's not the case that both
Yeah.
P and not P, and it's not the case that P or not P. So that's a situation where most of the time a category mistake will work because it's something otherwise than P or not P.
Mm.
But it doesn't have to be a category mistake. It could be a situation in which there is a claim that's made that's false, but not false in the sense of a category mistake where the two concepts are brought together in a nonsensical way,
Mhm.
but rather in a way that makes a certain presupposition that is false. Okay.
Mhm.
What that means is I tried to come up with an example of this that was not confusing. However, I'm not sure that I was successful. But if you go to page 16, um, here we have, excuse me, here we have the presupposition approach to interpreting the tetralemma. Now, again, maybe I'll just repeat this. If I say virtue is quadrilateral, it's not true, it's not false, it's not both true or not true, and it's not the case that it is either true or not true. It's something other than that. But it's only other than that because quadrilateral is completely nonsensical when it's applied to virtue.
Mhm.
But in this sentence, what we've got is a claim that is based on a false presupposition.
Mhm.
If I say the leader of every country is Taylor Swift, one way of looking at that from the point of view of Bertrand Russell is that there are two ways that that sentence can be false. The sentence is false that the leader of every country is Taylor Swift. But it could be the case that it's false because there's not just one person that's the leader of every country. Or it could be false because maybe there is one person that's the leader of every country, but it's not Taylor Swift,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
Right.
But Russell holds that a sentence like that is false, but there's some ambiguity with respect to how it's
Which
false.
part is false? Yeah.
Is it the whole sentence? Is it just the predicate that's false, etc.? What
Mhm.
P.F. Strawson argues is that no, actually the sentence is neither true nor false because it's based on the presupposition that there is exactly one person that's the leader of every country.
Mm.
Ah.
And if that sentence is false, the presupposition, then any sentence that might follow from it is actually not true or false. It's not true or false that the leader, the single leader of every country is Taylor Swift because the presupposition is wrong. Here's maybe an even more direct way of saying it. You know that classic example in like a courtroom where the prosecutor says, "Did you stop beating your wife? Have you
Mm.
stopped beating your wife?"
I was never
Mhm.
beating my wife.
I was never beating my wife, but the thing is, like, if I made the claim now instead of a question, if I made the claim, oh, he has stopped beating his wife,
Yeah. It's not
that
true or
sense
false
isn't
because you were never
false
beating my wife.
because the false version of it, he has stopped beating his wife is he has not stopped beating his wife, so he's still
Yeah.
beating his wife.
Yeah.
But if the presupposition is false that he was
Yeah.
ever beating his wife, then it's it's not false to say he has stopped beating his wife, because it's also false to say he has not stopped beating his wife because he never was beating his wife.
Yeah,
Mhm.
that's very clear. The thing with Taylor Swift, just to say the leader of every country is Taylor Swift, also just seems false to me. I mean, it doesn't. I understand what you just said with the courtroom case and the beating of the wife better, but
Yeah.
I suppose you're just making a different example.
Well, the reason that I chose this example was that in the case of have you stopped beating your wife, um, that that is not a sentence where Russell could say there are two different ways for it to be false.
No.
And I wanted to take one sentence that could either be interpreted as having two possible ways for it to be false, or could be interpreted as not being true or false because it's based on a false
I
preposition
see.
or a false
Okay.
presupposition. That
Mm.
I wanted to do the same thing with one sentence. And the reason that that works here is that, um, and this is actually much closer to what Strawson is actually arguing about, is that what the like if I say, for instance, I don't know, um, Matt, your one grandparent was Mexican. Is that sentence true or false? Well, maybe that's the sentence I should have used. I don't know. I presume you don't have any Mexican grandparents. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I should say your one grandparent, your single grandparent, your only grandparent was a
Yeah.
practicing Charvaka. Then maybe that's a better example here. Well, okay, it's hard to say that that's false because it's based on a presupposition that is false. And so if I say that oh, Matt, your one grandparent, blah blah blah, and then you say no, that's not true, and then I say, oh, so your one grandparent wasn't a practicing Charvaka? It's like no, no, that's not true either.
Yeah.
The point is that when you make a false presupposition, any sentence that is derived from that
Yeah.
is not, you can interpret it as not being true or false, but not because it's a category mistake,
Hmm.
but simply because there's a false presupposition.
Yeah, right. I get it.
Okay, now the reason that this is important for Nagarjuna is basically you could say it this way. Um, it's not necessarily a category mistake that what exists is interdependent being. Or maybe I'll say it this way. It's not necessarily a category mistake that it's possible that what exists could have independent being, right? Because just like your single grandparent, that person could have been Mexican or a practicing Charvaka or whatever. So it's not a category mistake. It's false, but it's also based on a false presupposition.
Yeah.
And if the false presupposition here is that what exists has this independent, substantial existence, if that itself is false, then anything that follows from that will be neither true nor false,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
I think, well, anyway, that's what Jan Vesterhoff has to say about it. It's another way of trying to deal with the logic of the
Okay.
tetralemma.
I know, Sandesh, you have to go. I
Yeah.
can't meet next Friday at this time. I didn't know
Fine.
if you guys want to continue at this time. I just can't. I just watch it later, or because I have auditions the next two
Yeah,
Fridays.
I mean, we can decide what we want to do. We're getting close to the point in the book that I want to stop reading. It's probably more reading than you want to do, but it might be good to. I think there's a Stanford Encyclopedia article on Jaina philosophy.
Mm.
Nice, maybe to get a little bit of the Jainas in here, just because it's a big gap in this book. Yeah, you don't have to read that, but I think it'd be useful to get um, a fuller picture of what's going on in
Uh-huh.
different traditions. By the way, also apparently Jainas, because they were so invested in this idea that everybody has a partial perspective on the truth, they faithfully recorded the positions of a bunch of other schools, and they're the source of the Charvaka uh, tradition. Everything
Mm.
else is
Mhm.
lost. It's only in the Jaina writings that
Huh.
you can find the Charvaka positions and stuff. Um, So, it's useful also from that perspective. But as I said, I think this book is mostly extremely focused on Nyāya Vaisheshika and
Yeah.
Madhyamaka,
Yeah.
which has some value to it, I guess. But he should have titled the book that way instead of Introduction to Indian Philosophy.
Yeah. Yeah.
In any case, yeah, maybe read a little bit about Jainas if you can.
Hmm.
Okay, pass that on. We'll see what I can get done.